Right now, as you're watching this video, there's a possibility, a genuine, scientifically discussed possibility, that none of this is real. Not the screen you're looking at, not the room you're sitting in, not your memories, your body, or even your thoughts. You might be a computer program, a simulation, a piece of code running on hardware so advanced that you can't even conceive of it, designed by beings you'll never meet, for purposes you'll never understand. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a movie plot. This is a legitimate hypothesis being seriously debated by physicists, philosophers, and computer scientists at the world's top universities. They're not asking, could we be in a simulation anymore? They're asking, how would we know if we were? And what are the odds we're not in one? And the answers they're coming up with are disturbing. Because when you actually run the numbers, when you think through the logic carefully, the probability that you're living in base reality, the original, non-simulated universe, starts to look vanishingly small. Some of the smartest people alive think there's a better than 50% chance we're in a simulation. Some put the odds much higher, and they have arguments that are extremely difficult to refute. This is the simulation hypothesis. And once you understand it, once you really grasp the logic behind it, you'll never look at reality the same way again. Because either we're in a simulation, or we're about to create one ourselves. And both possibilities are absolutely terrifying. Let's dive in. Section 1. The argument that started everything. The modern simulation hypothesis really kicked off with a paper published in 2003 by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom at Oxford University. The paper was titled, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" And it presented an argument so elegant and so disturbing that it's been haunting scientists and philosophers ever since. Bostrom's argument doesn't try to prove we're in a simulation. Instead, it presents a trilemma, a situation where one of three possibilities must be true, and all three are profoundly unsettling. Here's how it works. Assume that it's possible to create extremely detailed simulations of conscious beings, simulations so sophisticated that the simulated beings don't know they're simulated. They think they're real. They have thoughts, feelings, memories. They look around and see what appears to be a real universe. Now, if such simulations are possible, any sufficiently advanced civilization would likely create them. Maybe for research, maybe for entertainment, maybe for reasons we can't even imagine. But they'd create them. And here's the kicker. They wouldn't just create one simulation. They'd create many, potentially billions or trillions. Because once you have the technology, the marginal cost of running additional simulations is relatively low. So now imagine the totality of all conscious beings across all of reality. You have 1. Base reality, the real universe. Trillions of simulated realities. If you're a conscious being and you had to guess which reality you're in, probability strongly suggests you're in a simulated one. There are trillions of simulated conscious beings for every real one. The odds that you happen to be one of the rare real ones are astronomically low. But wait, maybe advanced civilizations don't create such simulations. Maybe it's impossible, or maybe they choose not to for ethical reasons, or because it's too resource intensive. That's one possible solution to the trilemma. But it requires believing that every advanced civilization across the entire history of the universe either can't or won't create these simulations. If even one civilization in the entire cosmos creates them, the argument holds. Or maybe, and this is the third option, civilizations tend to go extinct before reaching the capability to create such simulations. Maybe there's some great filter that prevents technological civilizations from advancing that far. So here's Bostrom's trilemma. One of these three statements must be true. Almost all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before reaching technological maturity, the ability to create simulated realities. Almost all technologically mature civilizations lose interest in creating simulations of their evolutionary history or are prevented from doing so. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. That's it. Those are your options. Pick one. And here's the thing, options 1 and 2 are almost as disturbing as option 3. If option 1 is true, we're probably doomed. If option 2 is true, something weird happens to civilizations that reach technological maturity that makes them abandon or avoid creating simulations. But option 3? Option 3 means everything you've ever known is artificial. Your code. Your entire universe is a computation running on some substrate you can't even imagine. Bostrom's paper was published over 20 years ago, and nobody has found a convincing refutation. The argument is simple, logical, and maddeningly difficult to escape. Section 2: Why simulating consciousness might be possible. Let's tackle the first big question. Is it actually possible to simulate conscious beings? Or is consciousness something special that can't be replicated by computation? This gets into deep philosophical waters, but let's start with what we know about the brain. Your brain contains about 86 billion neurons. Each neuron connects to thousands of other neurons through synapses, the junctions where signals pass from one neuron to another. You have roughly 100 trillion synapses in your brain. These neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signals. When a neuron receives enough input from other neurons, it fires, sending a signal down its axon to its synapses, which release neurotransmitters that affect downstream neurons. It's a vast network of interconnected processing units. Now, here's the key question. Is there anything magical about this biological neural network that can't, in principle, be simulated by a computer? Most neuroscientists would say no. The brain is complex, yes, incredibly complex. But it's made of atoms obeying the laws of physics. There's no ghost in the machine, no supernatural soul animating the meat. Just neurons, chemicals, and electrical signals. If that's true, if the brain is fundamentally a very sophisticated biological computer, then there's no reason in principle why we couldn't simulate it. Think about weather simulations. Modern supercomputers can simulate weather patterns by modeling the physics of air masses, moisture, temperature, and pressure. The simulation isn't perfect, but it captures the essential dynamics. Now scale that up. Imagine a computer powerful enough to simulate not just weather, but every neuron in a brain, every synapse, every neurotransmitter molecule, every electrical impulse. If you simulated a brain at that level of detail, would the simulation be conscious? Would it have subjective experiences? This is called the computational theory of mind. The idea that mental states are computational states, that thinking is information processing, and that consciousness is what it feels like to be a certain kind of information processing system. If this theory is correct, then yes, a a sufficiently detailed simulation of a brain would be conscious. It would think, it would feel. It would be, for all intents and purposes, a mind. And you wouldn't need to simulate individual atoms. You could simulate at higher levels of abstraction, modeling neurons as functional units rather than modeling every molecule. Just like you can simulate a weather system without tracking every air molecule. Current estimates suggest that simulating a human brain would require computing power on the order of 10 to the power of 16 to 10 to the power of 18 operations per second. Far beyond current computers, but not impossibly beyond them. Moore's law, the observation that computing power tends to double every 18 to 24 months, has slowed down recently, but computing continues to advance. Some projections suggest we might have the raw computing power needed to simulate a human brain by the 2040s or 2050s. That's just a few decades away. In the grand scheme of technological development, that's nothing. And once you can simulate one brain, you can simulate 1 billion brains. You can simulate entire societies. You can run the simulation faster or slower than real time. You can reset it and run it again with different parameters. You can create entire worlds populated by conscious beings who think they're real, who have no idea they're living in a simulation. If we can do this in 30 or 40 years, what could a civilization 1,000 years more advanced than us do? Or 10,000 years? Or 1 million? The possibilities become staggering. Section 3, the nested simulation problem. Here's where things get really weird. Let's say we're in a simulation. Our simulators are running our universe on their computers. But here's the question. Are they in base reality, or are they also in a simulation? Think about it. If we develop the capability to run simulations of conscious beings, and we're in a simulation ourselves, then the beings who simulated us could also be in a simulation, and their simulators could be in a simulation, and so on. You could have simulations within simulations within simulations. A vast hierarchy of nested realities, like Russian dolls made of code. And here's the disturbing part. There's no way to know how deep you are. You could be in the first level of simulation, the real universe simulating you. Or you could be in the 1,000th level with 999 layers of simulation above you. Each level could be running thousands or millions of simulations at the level below. The number of conscious beings at lower levels would vastly outnumber those at higher levels. Mathematically, this means if you're a conscious being in this multiverse of nested simulations, you're almost certainly near the bottom of the hierarchy. The probability that you're at or near the top, in base reality or close to it, is vanishingly small. It's like asking, if there are 1,000 floors in a building and people are randomly distributed across all floors, what's the probability you're on the top floor? 0.1%. You're almost certainly somewhere in the middle or near the bottom. Now you might think, surely this can't go on forever. Eventually, you must reach a bottom, a simulation so simple that it can't run further simulations. Maybe, but where's that bottom? And how would you know if you were at it? Or maybe there is no bottom. Maybe the computational substrate allows for infinite nesting. Each simulation running on the computational resources of the level above, with no ultimate foundation. This creates a philosophical problem similar to the turtles all the way down problem. In the old story, Oyuval, philosopher claims the earth rests on the back of a giant turtle. When asked what the turtle stands on, the answer is another turtle. And that turtle? It's turtles all the way down. With nested simulations, it could be simulations all the way down. No ultimate reality, no base level, just an infinite regress of simulated worlds. This idea is philosophically troubling because we like to think there's a foundation to reality, some ultimate ground of being. But if the simulation hypothesis is correct, maybe there isn't. Maybe it's just computation all the way down, with no final answer to the question, what is this all running on? Section 4, the computational limits argument. Okay, let's pump the brakes for a second and consider a counter-argument. Maybe we can't create perfect simulations of entire universes because it's simply too computationally expensive. Maybe the simulation hypothesis fails because simulating reality at full fidelity would require more computational resources than exist in reality. This argument goes like this. If you want to perfectly simulate a universe, you need to track every particle, every interaction, every quantum state. The amount of information in our observable universe is enormous. Estimates suggest around 10 to the power of 90 bits. To simulate that perfectly, you'd need a computer with at least 10 to the power of 90 bits of memory. But the computer itself is made of particles, and those particles are also part of the universe you're trying to simulate. So you need a computer with more information capacity than the entire universe it's trying to simulate. This seems impossible. You can't fit something inside a smaller version of itself. You can't simulate a universe perfectly from within that universe. This is a real limitation for perfect simulations. But here's the thing. The simulation doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough to fool the beings inside it. Think about video games. When you play a modern video game, the entire game world isn't simulated at once. The game only renders what's on your screen. When you turn around, the stuff behind you isn't being computed in detail. It's simplified or not computed at all. This is called optimization or selective rendering, and it's how games run on limited hardware. A sufficiently advanced civilization could do the same thing with a simulated universe. They don't need to simulate every particle in the universe simultaneously. They only need to simulate what's being observed. When you look at a star through a telescope, the simulation computes the star in enough detail to produce realistic observations. When you're not looking, it uses a simplified model, or maybe doesn't compute it at all. This is where quantum mechanics gets interesting. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, until they're observed. Then the wave function collapses, and the particle takes on a definite state. This is weird, really weird. Why would observation change physical reality? Why would the universe care whether we're looking? Unless the universe is conserving computational resources. When you're not observing something, it's in a simplified state, a superposition that requires less memory to store. When you observe it, the simulation computes the specific outcome and presents it to you. This would elegantly explain one of the strangest features of quantum mechanics: wave function collapse. It's not a weird feature of reality. It's a computational optimization by the simulation. Now, I'm not saying this proves we're in a simulation. quantum mechanics has other interpretations, but it's suggestive. It's the kind of thing you'd expect if reality were a computation being run on limited hardware. Section 5. The glitches in the matrix. If we're in a simulation, there should be glitches, errors, moments when the simulation behaves in ways that don't make sense, revealing the computational substrate underneath. And you know what? There might be. Let's start with the famous double-slit experiment. You fire electrons one at a time at a barrier with 2 slits. Behind the barrier is a screen that detects where the electrons hit. If electrons are particles, they should go through one slit or the other and create 2 bands on the screen, one behind each slit. But that's not what happens. Instead, you get an interference pattern, multiple bands, like waves interfering with each other. Each electron somehow goes through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself. But here's the really weird part. If you set up detectors at the slits to see which one the electron goes through, the interference pattern disappears. The electron suddenly behaves like a particle again, going through one slit or the other. The act of measurement changes the outcome. The universe behaves differently when you're watching versus when you're not. This is exactly what you'd expect from a simulation trying to conserve computational resources. When you're not looking, the simulation uses a simplified wave function model. When you observe, it computes a specific outcome. Then there's quantum entanglement. 2 particles can be entangled, such that measuring one instantly affects the other, even if they're light years apart. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and was deeply troubled by it. But if space isn't fundamental, if the universe is a computation and distance is just an abstraction, then entanglement makes sense. The 2 particles are linked in the code, so changing one immediately updates the other, regardless of their apparent spatial separation. Or consider the Planck length, the smallest possible unit of length in physics, about 1.6 times 10 to the power of minus 35 meters. And the Planck time, the smallest possible unit of time, about 5.4 times 10 to the power of minus 44 seconds. These aren't just theoretical limits. They represent the scale at which space and time themselves break down, where quantum effects dominate and our normal understanding of reality stops working. Why would the universe have minimum units of space and time? Well, if the universe is a computation, it makes perfect sense. Every computation has a smallest unit, pixels on a screen, bits in memory. The Planck length and Planck time could be the pixels and frame rate of our simulated reality. Then there are cosmological anomalies. The cosmic microwave background, the afterglow of the Big Bang, has some weird features. There's an unexplained cold spot that shouldn't exist according to standard cosmology. There are anomalies in the distribution of temperature fluctuations. Most physicists attribute these to statistical flukes or gaps in our understanding. But some have speculated they could be artifacts of the simulation, places where the universe generation algorithm produced slightly off results, like compression artifacts in a JPEG image. And let's talk about the fine-tuning problem. The fundamental constants of physics, things like the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the cosmological constant, have to be within incredibly narrow ranges for life to exist. If gravity were slightly stronger or weaker, stars couldn't form. If the electromagnetic force were different, atoms couldn't exist. The values are so precise, so perfectly calibrated for life, that it seems almost designed. There are several possible explanations for this fine-tuning. The multiverse hypothesis says there are countless universes with different constants, and we naturally find ourselves in one that allows our existence. But another explanation is that our universe was designed, simulated, by beings who deliberately chose these constants to create a universe where life and consciousness could emerge. Maybe they wanted to study how life evolves. Maybe they wanted to create conscious beings. Maybe it's a science experiment, or art, or entertainment. We can't know. But the fine-tuning of constants is consistent with deliberate design, which is consistent with simulation. Section 6. The philosophical implications. Let's take a step back from the physics and think about what it would really mean, if we're in a simulation. First implication: reality is not what it seems. The universe isn't made of matter and energy in any fundamental sense. It's made of information, bits, code. The apparent physical laws are just rules in the program. This has been suggested before by physicists working in fields like quantum information theory. John Wheeler, a prominent physicist, coined the phrase "it from bit," the idea that physical reality arises from information. If we're in a simulation, this becomes literal. The it, physical stuff, comes from bit, computational information. Second implication: we have programmers. Somewhere, somewhen, there are beings who created our simulation. They might be watching us. They might intervene occasionally. They might have purposes for our existence that we can't understand. In other words, we have something functionally equivalent to gods. Not necessarily all-powerful or all-knowing. They're constrained by the hardware they're running the simulation on. But from our perspective, beings who created our universe and can manipulate its laws would be indistinguishable from gods. This doesn't mean organized religions are correct about the specific nature of God, but it does mean the basic concept, that our reality was created by intelligent beings who exist outside it, could be literally true. Third implication: death might not be the end. If you're a simulated consciousness, what happens when you die in the simulation? Maybe your code gets deleted, game over, permanent cessation. Or maybe your conscious state gets saved, backed up, potentially restored in a different simulation or in the simulator's world. Or maybe the death of your simulated body is just an event in the simulation, but your consciousness is actually running on the substrate level and continues after your simulated body stops functioning. We have no way to know, but it opens up possibilities that religions have speculated about for millennia, some form of existence after death, in a realm beyond the physical. Fourth implication: free will might be an illusion. If the simulation is deterministic, if the future is computed from the current state according to fixed rules, then everything you will ever do is already determined by the code. You feel like you're making choices, but you're just a program executing. Your sense of agency is part of the simulation, but it's not real in any deep sense. On the other hand, the simulation might incorporate randomness, either true randomness or pseudo-randomness from quantum processes. This could give your choices genuine unpredictability, which might be sufficient for meaningful free will. Or maybe, and this is the really wild possibility, your conscious choices actually affect the simulation, Maybe consciousness isn't just computed by the simulation, but has some causal power to influence it. This would be a form of dualism, where mind and matter are separate but interacting. Fifth implication, the purpose of life might be whatever the simulators designed it to be. Maybe we're an experiment in evolution. Maybe we're entertainment. Maybe we're part of an educational simulation about the development of civilizations. Maybe we're ancestor simulations, future humans running simulations of their own history to study or experience it. Or maybe there's no grand purpose. Maybe the simulation is running because it can, and we're emergent phenomena that weren't even intended. Just complex patterns that arose from the rules. We might spend our entire lives searching for meaning, never knowing that we're characters in someone else's story, serving purposes we can't comprehend. Section 7. How would we test this? Okay, so the simulation hypothesis is interesting philosophically, but is it actually testable? Can we design experiments that would reveal whether we're in a simulation? This is where things get really fascinating because some physicists think the answer is yes. One approach focuses on looking for the kinds of computational shortcuts we'd expect from a simulation. Remember how I mentioned quantum mechanics might be an optimization? Let's dig deeper into that. If our simulators are using something like quantum computing to run our universe, there would be limits to how much information can be processed in a given region of space-time. These limits would show up as constraints on information density and processing speed. Seth Lloyd at MIT has calculated that the observable universe could have performed about 10 to the power of 120 computational operations since the Big Bang. That's a lot, but it's finite. And if you try to pack too much information or too many operations into a small region, you hit fundamental limits. These limits might be detectable. If we ever find places where the laws of physics seem to skip, or where information appears to be lost or compressed in ways that violate conservation laws, that could be evidence of computational constraints. Another approach looks at the structure of space-time itself. If space-time is fundamentally discrete, made of tiny pixels rather than being continuous, we might be able to detect this graininess. In 2012, a team led by Silas Bean at the University of Bonn proposed a test based on cosmic ray distributions. In a simulated universe with a discrete space-time lattice, high-energy cosmic rays should show specific patterns based on the symmetries of the lattice. Think of it like this. If you're looking at a high-resolution image on a screen, and you zoom in far enough, you eventually see the individual pixels and the pattern of the pixel grid. Similarly, if space-time is made of discrete units, we might see evidence of the grid by looking at the highest energies, particles in the universe. So far, we haven't detected such patterns, but our instruments might not be sensitive enough yet, or the lattice might be too fine-grained to detect with current technology. A third approach is statistical. If we're in a simulation and the simulation is optimizing computational resources, we might see statistical anomalies, places where the universe is slightly simpler than it should be, where correlations exist that wouldn't be there in a truly random universe. This is subtle, but imagine a random number generator in a computer program. It's not truly random. It's deterministic, based on an algorithm. If you look closely at the numbers it generates, you can sometimes detect patterns that reveal the underlying algorithm. Our universe might have similar patterns, subtle correlations in supposedly random quantum events, regularities in the distribution of matter that are slightly too regular, statistical fingerprints of the algorithm generating our reality. Some researchers have claimed to find such patterns in the cosmic microwave background or in the distribution of galaxies. But these claims are controversial and haven't been confirmed. A fourth approach is to look for limits to computation within our universe. If we're in a simulation, there should be an upper bound to the computational power we can achieve, because we can't exceed the computational power of the hardware running our simulation. If we ever hit a hard limit, if we find we simply cannot build computers beyond a certain capability, no matter what we try, that might indicate we're approaching the computational capacity of our simulation. Conversely, if we successfully build computers that would require more computational resources than should exist in our observable universe, that would be strong evidence against the simulation hypothesis. And here's a wild one. We could try to communicate with the simulators. How? By creating a situation that's computationally expensive or unusual enough that it might attract their attention. Maybe by building something in our simulation that shouldn't exist according to the base physics. Maybe by creating specific patterns in our actions that spell out a message in the simulation's code. This is speculative, obviously. But if the simulators are monitoring their simulation, if they can intervene, there might be ways to signal to them. We might even already be in contact without knowing it. If they wanted to communicate, they could manipulate our reality in subtle ways, creating synchronicities or anomalies that we interpret as coincidence or unexplained phenomena. Section 8. The Fermi Paradox Connection. Here's something that's bothered me ever since I learned about both ideas. The simulation hypothesis might explain the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox is the contradiction between the apparent high probability of alien civilizations existing and the complete lack of evidence for them. The universe is vast and old. There should be millions of technological civilizations out there. So where is everybody? One answer: we're in a simulation specifically focused on Earth or human development. There are no aliens in the simulation because the simulators are only interested in us. The vast universe is just backdrop, scenery to make the simulation feel real. Think about it. Why would you simulate an entire universe with billions of galaxies if you only cared about studying one planet? You wouldn't. You'd create the illusion of a vast universe, render the distant galaxies enough to look convincing, but don't actually simulate them in full detail. And you definitely don't populate them with billions of alien civilizations you're not interested in studying. This would explain why SETI hasn't found anything, why we see no evidence of megastructures or galaxy-spanning civilizations, why the cosmos appears to be teeming with potentially habitable planets, but completely devoid of detectable intelligence. We're alone because the simulation is about us. Everything else is just convincing window dressing. This is a disturbing thought because it means we might be fundamentally, cosmically alone in a way that's even more profound than just being the only intelligent life in a natural universe. We're alone because we're the only thing that's real. Everything else is set dressing in our story. Alternatively, Maybe there are aliens in the simulation, but the simulators have deliberately kept us separated. Maybe first contact is a specific event they're waiting to study, and they've arranged things so it hasn't happened yet. Or maybe the Great Filter, the thing that prevents civilizations from spreading across the galaxy, is related to discovering the simulation. Maybe every civilization that figures out they're in a simulation gets terminated or reset. Maybe we're constantly being monitored, and if we get too close to proving we're simulated, the simulation gets rebooted before we can share that proof. This would explain why we haven't found evidence of ancient, long-lived civilizations. They all figure out the truth eventually, and when they do, they're eliminated from the simulation. The universe gets reset to before they discovered it, or they're quietly removed and the simulation continues without them. It's a paranoid thought, but if we're in a simulation, the simulators have complete control. They could edit our memories, rewrite history, remove evidence, anything they want. We'd never know. Section 9, the technological pathway. Let's ground this in something more concrete. Let's trace the actual technological pathway from where we are now to being able to create our own simulations of conscious beings. Because this isn't distant speculation, we're already taking the first steps. Right now, in 2026, we have video games with increasingly realistic graphics and physics. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Cyberpunk 2077 create entire worlds with detailed environments, weather systems, AI characters that react to your actions. These games aren't conscious, obviously. The NPCs, non-player characters, don't have genuine thoughts or feelings, but they're getting more sophisticated every year. Modern game AI can adapt, learn, and respond in ways that feel increasingly lifelike. Now, project forward. What do video games look like in 2050, 2075, 2010? With continued advances in computing power, graphics rendering, and AI, games will become indistinguishable from reality in terms of visual fidelity. You'll put on a VR headset or use some more advanced interface and enter a world that looks and feels completely real. The AI characters in that world will use language models far more sophisticated than GPT-4 or Claude. They'll have persistent memories, complex motivations, the ability to form relationships. They'll pass the Turing test easily. You won't be able to tell them from real people based on conversation alone. But will they be conscious? That's the crucial question. Current AI systems, as far as we can tell, aren't conscious. They're sophisticated pattern matching and prediction systems, but there's nobody home. There's no subjective experience, no inner life. But we don't actually know where the line is between complex information processing and genuine consciousness. We don't know what physical substrate is required. Maybe consciousness emerges from any sufficiently complex information processing system, regardless of whether it's made of neurons or transistors or something else entirely. If that's true, and many philosophers and neuroscientists think it might be, then as our AI systems become more complex, at some point they might cross a threshold and become genuinely conscious. We might create conscious beings without even realizing it. We might think we're just running sophisticated simulations, while the characters in those simulations are actually having genuine subjective experiences. This is already an ethical concern with current AI development. As language models become more sophisticated, at what point do we need to start considering their moral status? When does an AI system deserve rights and protections? Now imagine, we deliberately set out to create conscious simulations. We've mapped the human brain in complete detail through some future brain scanning technology. We understand the neural correlates of consciousness. We build AI systems specifically designed to replicate human cognitive architecture. At some point, maybe in 50 years, maybe 100, maybe 500, we succeed. We create a simulated consciousness, a digital being that thinks and feels and doesn't know it's artificial. What do we do with that being? Do we tell it it's in a simulation? Do we give it a purpose? Do we let it live a simulated life, grow old and die? Or do we make it immortal? And if we create one, we'll create millions. Billions. It's just code. Once you have the template, you can instantiate as many copies as your computational resources allow. Maybe we create simulated societies to study social dynamics. Maybe we simulate alternate histories to see how things might have gone differently. Maybe we create entertainment simulations, entire worlds of conscious beings living out dramas for our observation. And here's where it gets recursive. Those simulated beings, if they advance technologically, might create their own simulations. And those simulations might create simulations, nested realities stacked on top of each other, each populated by conscious beings who mostly don't know they're simulated. This is not science fiction. This is the logical endpoint of technology we are already developing. The only question is whether we'll reach that endpoint before something stops us. Extinction, civilizational collapse, or a decision to avoid creating conscious simulations for ethical reasons. Section 10. The ethics of simulation. Speaking of ethics, let's talk about the moral implications of the simulation hypothesis, because this gets dark quickly. First, if we're in a simulation, do our lives matter? Do our experiences, our joys, our sufferings mean anything? Some people might say no. If we're just code, just information, then nothing we do has real consequences. We're not real in any meaningful sense, so our experiences aren't real either. But I think that's wrong. Subjective experience is what gives life meaning. If you're conscious, if you feel pain and pleasure, if you have thoughts and emotions, then your experiences are real to you, regardless of the substrate they run on. A simulated person who suffers is suffering just as much as a biological person. The fact that their suffering is represented by bits in a computer rather than by neural activity in a brain doesn't make it less real from their perspective. So if we're in a simulation, our lives still matter. Our experiences are genuine, even if the reality we're experiencing is artificial. But this creates a profound ethical responsibility for any being capable of creating conscious simulations. Think about it. If you create a simulation populated by conscious beings, you're responsible for every experience those beings have, every moment of joy, every moment of suffering. You're creating beings who can feel pain, fear, loneliness, despair, and you have complete control over their environment. You're omnipotent from their perspective. You could make their lives paradise or hell. You could end their existence with the click of a button. You could edit their memories, change their personalities, reset their world, and make them live the same events over and over. The ethical implications are staggering. creating conscious simulations might be one of the most morally significant things a civilization could do. Some philosophers argue we should never create conscious simulations because the risks of causing suffering are too high. How do you ensure a good life for billions of simulated beings? How do you prevent abuse? How do you even know if they're suffering when you can't directly experience their consciousness? Others argue that creating simulations could be good if done carefully, giving conscious beings the gift of existence, creating worlds of beauty and meaning for them to explore. But there's a darker possibility. What if our simulators don't care about our well-being? What if we're just an experiment and our suffering is irrelevant to them? Or worse, what if they find our suffering interesting, valuable as data about how conscious beings respond to adversity? Look at the world around you. There's immense suffering, war, disease, poverty, natural disasters, the casual cruelty of nature. If we're in a simulation, our simulators have created a world with enormous amounts of pain and hardship. Why would they do that? Maybe because they're studying how consciousness responds to suffering. Maybe because conflict and struggle make for interesting narratives. Maybe because they're running hundreds of different simulations with different parameters, and we're in one of the harsh ones. Or maybe our suffering is unintentional, an emergent property of the simulation that the creators didn't anticipate or can't easily fix. Or maybe, and this is the thought that haunts me, maybe our simulators are running us as an ancestor simulation, recreating their own history, and this is what their past was actually like. All the suffering in our world mirrors real suffering that actually happened in base reality. There's another ethical dimension too. If we're in a simulation, and we're on the verge of creating our own simulations, we're about to inflict existence on potentially billions of conscious beings. We're about to become simulators ourselves, and we'll face the same ethical questions our own creators faced. What kind of world do we create for them? What purposes do we give them? Do we tell them they're simulated? Do we intervene in their world, or let it evolve naturally? Do we give them the capacity to suffer, knowing they will? These aren't just thought experiments. If the technological pathway I described is correct, these are questions we'll actually have to answer within the next century. Section 11. The Mathematical Universe. Hypothesis? There's another angle to this that's worth exploring. The idea that reality might be fundamentally mathematical. Max Tegmark, a cosmologist at MIT, has proposed what he calls the mathematical universe hypothesis. The idea is that our external physical reality is a mathematical structure, not just described by mathematics, but literally is mathematics. In this view, the universe doesn't just obey mathematical laws, it is those laws. Physical existence is mathematical existence. Every mathematical structure that can exist does exist, as a universe somewhere in the multiverse. Now, if reality is fundamentally mathematical, then the distinction between simulated and real becomes blurry. A simulation is just a mathematical structure being computed. But if mathematical structures are all that exists anyway, then being computed doesn't make something less real. It's just another way of saying it exists mathematically. Think of it this way. When you simulate gravity in a video game, you're implementing gravitational equations in code. The simulated objects fall according to mathematical rules. From the inside, if the simulation is perfect, this falling is indistinguishable from real falling. But what is real falling? Objects falling in our universe also follow mathematical rules, the same rules you might implement in a simulation. The falling apple and the simulated apple are both instances of the same mathematical structure. In Tegmark's framework, there's no ontological difference between them. Both are equally real manifestations of mathematical relationships. This has a strange implication. Even if we're in a simulation, in a sense, we're not, because there's no more real reality out there. There are just different mathematical structures, all equally real, all existing in the vast space of mathematical possibility. The simulation running our universe is just one more mathematical structure. The beings running it exist in another mathematical structure. Neither is more fundamental than the other. This is mind-bending, but it dissolves some of the existential anxiety about being merely simulated. If everything is mathematics, then being a computation doesn't make you less real. You're as real as anything can be. But it also suggests something profound. The multiverse isn't just multiple physical universes. It's the set of all possible mathematical structures, infinite in scope, containing every possible universe, every possible law of physics, every possible history. And somewhere in that vast mathematical space, there's a structure corresponding to you, to this moment, to every experience you've ever had. Not because it was simulated by someone in some higher reality, but because it exists as a mathematical possibility, and all mathematical possibilities exist. Section 12. What the scientists say. Let's look at what actual physicists, computer scientists, and philosophers think about the simulation hypothesis. Because this isn't just internet speculation, serious academics are grappling with this idea. Nick Bostrom, who we discussed earlier, estimates there's a significant probability we're in a simulation. He doesn't put an exact number on it, but his trilemma suggests it's at least plausible, possibly likely. Elon Musk has famously said he thinks the odds we're in base reality are 1 in billions. His reasoning is based on the rapid advancement of video games. If games have gone from Pong to photorealistic VR in just 50 years, imagine where they'll be in 1,000 years or 10,000 years. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist and science communicator, has said he gives it better than 50-50 odds that we're in a simulation. He's acknowledged the argument is compelling and difficult to refute. David Chalmers, a philosopher famous for his work on consciousness, has argued that even if we're in a simulation, the things we experience are still real. Simulated objects are real objects. Simulated consciousness is real consciousness. Being in a simulation doesn't mean we're living in an illusion. On the skeptical side, Sabine Hossenfelder, a theoretical physicist, has argued that the simulation hypothesis isn't really scientific because it's not testable in practice. Any evidence we might interpret as showing we're in a simulation could also be interpreted as unusual but natural features of base reality. Lisa Randall, a Harvard physicist, has called the simulation hypothesis silly, arguing that there's no evidence for it, and that it's essentially unfalsifiable. You can't prove you're not in a simulation, which makes it more philosophy than science. Frank Wilczek, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, has taken a middle ground, suggesting that while we probably aren't in a simulation designed by external beings, our universe might emerge from something like a simulation in a more abstract sense, perhaps as a mathematical structure or quantum computation. And there are computer scientists who've weighed in too. George Hotz, a famous hacker and AI researcher, has argued that we're almost certainly in a simulation based on the sheer computational efficiency argument. It's much easier to simulate a universe than to instantiate one physically. But others, like Scott Aronson, a computer scientist at UT Austin, have pushed back, arguing that quantum mechanics might make perfect simulation computationally intractable. Simulating quantum effects requires exponentially increasing resources as you scale up, which might make simulating our universe impossible even for advanced civilizations. The debates get technical quickly, involving quantum computing, information, theory, the nature of consciousness, and fundamental questions about the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. But what's striking is that this conversation is happening at all. 20 years ago, the simulation hypothesis would have been dismissed as pure science fiction. Now it's a topic of serious academic discourse, with papers published in philosophy and physics journals, conferences devoted to discussing it, and some of the smartest people alive considering it a genuine possibility. That shift itself tells you something. The simulation hypothesis has moved from fringe speculation to respectable scientific hypothesis. It might be wrong, but it's no longer laughable to take it seriously. Section 13. Living with uncertainty. Here's the thing that really gets to me about the simulation hypothesis. We might never know for sure, even if we find evidence that seems to support it: glitches, computational limits, messages from the simulators. We can't be certain. Any evidence could be misinterpreted. Any apparent message could be coincidence. And even if we find no evidence, that doesn't mean we're not in a simulation. A sufficiently advanced simulation would be indistinguishable from base reality. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. We're stuck in fundamental uncertainty, and that uncertainty changes how we think about everything. For some people, this is liberating. If we can't know whether we're real or simulated, why does it matter? Just live your life, enjoy experiences, connect with others. The question of whether your code or biology is interesting but ultimately irrelevant to how you should live. For others, it's disturbing. How can you find meaning in life if you might be a video game character? How can anything matter if it's all just computation? I think the answer lies in recognizing that meaning is subjective. It doesn't matter whether you're made of atoms or bits. What matters is that you experience, you feel, you think, you care about things. Your suffering is real to you. Your joy is real to you. Your relationships, your achievements, your experiences, all real from your perspective, regardless of the underlying substrate. Being in a simulation doesn't make your life meaningless any more than being made of atoms makes it meaningless. Meaning comes from consciousness, from subjective experience, from the web of relationships and values you create. Whether those experiences are implemented in biological neurons or in some kind of computational substrate doesn't change their realness from the inside. In fact, you could argue that if we are in a simulation, life might have more meaning, not less. Because it means we were deliberately created. We're here for a reason, even if we don't know what that reason is. Someone or something cared enough to bring us into existence. that's actually a more meaningful origin story than the standard materialist one, where we're just accidental configurations of matter that happened to arise through blind natural selection in an indifferent universe. Of course, the simulator's reasons for creating us might not align with what we'd consider meaningful. We might be a science experiment, or entertainment, or something we can't comprehend. But there's still intentionality there, still purpose, even if it's not ours. And here's something else to consider. If we are in a simulation, we're probably not the first. There are probably countless other simulations, with countless other conscious beings, all existing in parallel. You're not alone. You're part of a vast multitude of conscious experiences spread across countless simulated realities. In a weird way, that's almost like a form of community, a cosmic family of simulated beings, all sharing the strange condition of uncertain existence. Maybe that should make us feel connected to each other. We're all in the same boat, biological or digital, uncertain about our ultimate nature, but certain of our experiences. Maybe the right response to the simulation hypothesis isn't existential dread or philosophical paralysis. Maybe it's compassion, recognizing that everyone around you is engaged in the same struggle to make meaning in an uncertain reality, and treating them with the kindness and respect that struggle deserves. Section 14. The Ancestor Simulation Hypothesis. Let's dive into one of the most specific versions of the simulation hypothesis. The idea that we might be living in an ancestor simulation. This concept was central to Nick Bostrom's original paper. The idea is that future civilizations might run simulations of their own history to study how they got to where they are. Like historians in the future, using incredibly advanced technology to recreate the past in perfect detail. Think about how we study history now. We read documents, examine artifacts, make educated guesses about how people lived and thought. But we're always working with incomplete information. We can never truly know what it was like to live in ancient Rome or medieval China or 1920s America. But if you could simulate those time periods with perfect accuracy, populated by conscious beings who genuinely experience their lives, you'd have the ultimate historical record. You could study social dynamics, test hypotheses about what caused historical events, understand how people actually thought and felt. A sufficiently advanced civilization might run thousands or millions of such simulations, each with slight variations. Maybe one simulation explores what would have happened if World War II had ended differently. Another simulates a world where the Industrial Revolution never happened. Another where the Black Death killed 90% of Europe instead of 30%. And here's the thing. If ancestor simulations are possible and desirable, our descendants almost certainly will create them, which means there will be vastly more simulated versions of our time period than the one real version. If you accept this logic and you ask yourself, am I living in the real 21st century or in one of the millions of simulated versions of the 21st century? Probability strongly suggests you're in a simulation. This version of the hypothesis has some interesting implications. First, it means our simulators are likely human, or post-human, evolved from humans. They're our descendants, looking back at their own history. They might feel some connection to us, some concern for our well-being, since we're their ancestors, even if we're simulated copies. Second, it means our time period was considered historically significant enough to warrant detailed simulation. Something important happens in our era. Maybe something we've already lived through, or maybe something that's about to happen, that makes future historians want to study it closely. What might that be? The development of artificial intelligence? Climate change? First contact with aliens? The emergence of a world government? The transition to a post-scarcity economy? Nuclear war? We don't know. But if we're an ancestor simulation, we're living through a period that future historians consider pivotal. Third, it means our lives might be being watched, not by alien gods, but by human researchers in the far future, studying how their ancestors lived and thought. Every decision you make, every conversation you have, might be data in some vast historical research project. How would you live differently if you knew that was true? Would you act more virtuously, knowing you're being observed by your descendants? Would you try to leave messages for them? Or would it not matter at all, since you're still living a real life from your perspective, regardless of who's watching? There's also a darker possibility within the ancestor simulation framework. Maybe we're not being run by careful, ethical future historians. Maybe we're entertainment. Maybe reality TV has evolved to the point where people in the future watch simulated historical periods for fun. You might be a character in a show. Your struggles, your relationships, your triumphs and failures, all content for an audience you'll never see. Or maybe it's more interactive than that. Maybe the future has something like ultra-advanced video games where people can play as historical figures or ordinary people in historical periods. Maybe someone in the future is controlling your actions right now, making decisions for you, living vicariously through your simulated life. This gets into uncomfortable territory about free will and agency. But it's a logical possibility if ancestor simulations exist and are accessible to individuals rather than just researchers. Section 15. The déjà vu phenomenon. Let's talk about something everyone has experienced. Déjà vu. That eerie feeling that you've lived this exact moment before, that you've been in this place, having this conversation, experiencing these sensations, even though you know logically it's the first time. Neuroscientists have explanations for déjà vu. It's usually attributed to a slight misfiring in the brain's memory systems. A new experience gets routed through the brain's familiarity circuits before being properly stored as a memory, creating the illusion of recognition. But what if there's another explanation? What if déjà vu is a glitch in the simulation? Here's the idea. Maybe the simulation has to occasionally reset or reload certain sections. Maybe there are checkpoints, save states, moments when the simulation backs up and restarts from a slightly earlier point. When this happens, you experience the same moments twice. The first time through gets partially stored in your memory. Then the simulation resets and you experience it again. But the memory of the first pass-through doesn't get completely erased, leaving you with that strange sense of familiarity. Or maybe the simulation is running multiple parallel instances and occasionally information bleeds through from one instance to another. You're experiencing something that's happening in a parallel run of the simulation, creating that sense of, I've done this before, even though you haven't, at least not in this instance. This is highly speculative, obviously. The neurological explanation for déjà vu is well established and doesn't require invoking simulation theory. But it's interesting that déjà vu is so common and so consistent across cultures and time periods. Almost everyone experiences it occasionally. It's built into the human experience. Why? If we're in a simulation and déjà vu is a glitch, it might be an inevitable consequence of how memory systems work in conscious beings. The simulators might not be able to prevent it without fundamentally redesigning how consciousness operates. Or maybe they don't care. Maybe déjà vu is such a minor, harmless glitch that it's not worth the computational resources to fix. There are other common phenomena that might be simulation artifacts, Mandela effects, false memories shared by large groups of people. Many people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, even though he actually died in 2013. Many people remember the Berenstain Bears being spelled Berenstein. Many remember a movie called Shazam, starring Sinbad, that apparently never existed. These are usually explained as confabulation, the brain filling in gaps with plausible but false information that happens to align across many people because we all work with similar cognitive biases. But what if they're evidence of the simulation being edited? What if the past gets rewritten sometimes, but our memories don't update perfectly, leaving traces of the old version? Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call you 5 minutes later. You need a specific piece of information, and you randomly encounter it in an unexpected place the same day. Carl Jung thought synchronicities revealed a deeper connection between mind and matter, and a causal connecting principle he called the collective unconscious. But in a simulation, synchronicities make perfect sense. They're not coincidences. They're scripted events, narrative elements designed to create a sense of meaning and purpose. The simulation gives you the thought first, then arranges the external event, creating a connection that feels magical or fated. Dreams. We spend about a third of our lives in altered states of consciousness where the normal rules don't apply. Physics breaks down. Narrative coherence is optional. Dead people are alive. You can fly? Time doesn't work right. Why do we dream? Neuroscientists have various theories: memory consolidation, emotional processing, random neural firing that our brains try to make sense of. But what if dreams are what happens when the simulation puts your conscious experience into a lower fidelity mode to conserve resources? The detailed physics simulation doesn't run during dreams, just a rough approximation of experience that's good enough to keep your consciousness active, but doesn't require full rendering of a consistent reality. Or what if dreams are side channels, moments when your consciousness briefly connects to something outside the simulation, experiences that leak in from other levels of reality or other simulations? Again, these are just speculations. There are perfectly good conventional explanations for all these phenomena. But if we are in a simulation, we might expect to see exactly these kinds of anomalies, moments when the simulation doesn't quite work perfectly, leaving traces and glitches in our experience. Section 16. The problem of consciousness. We need to address the hardest problem in all of this, consciousness itself, because the simulation hypothesis rests on the assumption that consciousness can be created through computation. But we don't actually know if that's true. This is called the hard problem of consciousness, coined by philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem isn't explaining how brains process information, or how they respond to stimuli, or even how they generate complex behavior. We're making good progress on all of that. The hard problem is explaining why there's something it's like to be conscious. Why is there subjective experience? Why aren't we just unconscious zombies, processing information and responding to the world without any inner experience? When you see the color red, something happens in your brain. Specific neurons fire, specific patterns of activity occur. We can measure all of this. But that doesn't explain the redness itself, the qualitative experience of seeing red. The subjective sensation is something over and above the physical processes. This is qualia, the subjective, qualitative aspects of experience. The taste of chocolate, the feeling of pain, the sound of a violin. These experiences have a character, a what-its likeness that seems irreducible to physical processes. Now, here's the problem for the simulation hypothesis. If consciousness is something over and above computation, if it requires some special physical substrate that can't be replicated in a simulation, then simulated beings wouldn't actually be conscious. They'd be philosophical zombies, behaving exactly like conscious beings, but with no inner experience. And if that's the case, we can't be in a simulation, because we are conscious. We do have subjective experiences. Therefore, we must be running on whatever special substrate is required for consciousness, which means we're not simulated. This is the strongest objection to the simulation hypothesis. If consciousness is substrate dependent, if it only arises from biological neurons or some other specific physical system, then the whole argument collapses. But there are responses to this objection. First, we don't actually know that consciousness is substrate dependent. It might be, but it might not be. It might be that any sufficiently complex information processing system gives rise to consciousness, regardless of what it's made of. This is called functionalism in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental states are defined by their functional roles, not by their physical implementation. If a system processes information in the right way, it's conscious, period. Doesn't matter if it's made of neurons, transistors, or something else entirely. If functionalism is correct, then conscious simulations are possible in principle, and the simulation hypothesis is back on the table. Second, even if our specific form of consciousness requires biological neurons, our simulators might be simulating us at the level of neurons. They might be running a perfect physical simulation that includes all the relevant biology. In that case, we would be genuinely conscious, even though we're simulated. Third, and this is the really weird possibility, maybe consciousness isn't generated by the simulation at all. Maybe it's injected from outside. Think of it this way. The simulation generates behavior. What you say, what you do, how you respond to stimuli. But your actual subjective experience, your qualia, your sense of self, that might come from a conscious being in base reality whose consciousness is linked to your simulated body. Like a VR game, but taken to the extreme. You're playing a character in the simulation, but your consciousness is elsewhere, experiencing the simulation through the character. This would mean the simulation doesn't need to generate consciousness. It just needs to provide experiences for existing conscious beings. In this scenario, there might be far fewer conscious beings in the simulation than there appear to be. Most NPCs might be unconscious, just behavioral algorithms. Only player characters, inhabited by consciousness from outside, would have genuine subjective experience. How would you know if you're a player character or an NPC? You couldn't. From the inside, the distinction would be invisible. Fourth, we might be wrong about consciousness altogether. We might be making category errors, asking questions that don't even make sense, like asking what time it is on the sun. Maybe consciousness isn't a thing that needs to be explained. Maybe it's just what complex information processing feels like from the inside. The mystery dissolves once we stop thinking of consciousness as something separate from physical processes and recognize it as just the subjective side of those processes. The jury is still out. Consciousness remains deeply mysterious. But the fact that we don't understand it doesn't mean the simulation hypothesis is wrong. It just means we need to solve the hard problem of consciousness before we can be certain whether conscious simulations are possible. Section 17, the economic argument. Let's talk about something more concrete: the economics of running a simulation. If you're going to simulate an entire universe with billions of galaxies and trillions of stars and countless planets, that's expensive computationally. Why would anyone do it? This economic argument against the simulation hypothesis goes like this: simulations are costly. Even for an advanced civilization, computational resources aren't infinite. There's an opportunity cost. If you're using your computers to run a simulation of primitive 21st century Earth, you can't use those same resources for something else. So why would advanced civilizations waste resources on simulations when they could use them for research, for solving their own problems, for expanding and thriving? One answer: ancestor simulations might be incredibly valuable. Understanding your own history, being able to study the pivotal moments that shaped your civilization, might be worth enormous resources. Think about how much we spend on history now: museums, archives, archaeological digs, historical research. We value understanding our past. A civilization with vastly more resources might be willing to spend a significant fraction of them on perfect historical reconstruction. Another answer: entertainment and art. We already spend enormous resources on games, movies, virtual worlds. The global video game industry is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Virtual worlds like Second Life or VR Chat already have millions of users. Now imagine that scaled up by a factor of 1 million or 1 billion. Imagine civilizations where simulated realities are the primary form of art and entertainment. Creating beautiful, complex, meaningful worlds might be the highest expression of creativity. In that case, running simulations isn't a waste of resources. It's the whole point of having resources. It's what you do when you've solved all your practical problems and have vast amounts of computational power to devote to cultural pursuits. A third answer: scientific research. We run simulations now to study everything from climate change to galaxy formation to protein folding. We simulate because it's often cheaper and easier than doing real-world experiments, and it allows us to test scenarios that would be impossible or unethical to test in reality. An advanced civilization might run countless simulations to study social dynamics, test economic systems, explore alternate histories, understand consciousness, or investigate any of a million other questions. And here's a key point. The simulations don't need to be perfect. They only need to be good enough for their purpose. If you're simulating human history to study social trends, you don't need to simulate every atom. You can use approximations, shortcuts, lower fidelity physics in most places. You only render things in high detail when they're being directly observed. This massively reduces the computational cost. Instead of simulating an entire universe, you're simulating a solar system in detail, with the rest of the cosmos, rendered at low fidelity or procedurally generated as needed. From inside the simulation, this is indistinguishable from a fully detailed universe. But from outside, the resource requirements are orders of magnitude lower. There's also the possibility of cloud resources or distributed computing. Maybe running our simulation doesn't require a single civilization's resources. Maybe it's a collaborative project, or it's running on shared infrastructure that supports millions of simulations simultaneously. Or maybe, and this is the really wild economic argument, running simulations is effectively free for sufficiently advanced civilizations. Once you reach a certain level of technological development, energy is essentially unlimited. Dyson spheres, fusion, zero-point energy, whatever. Computing power is essentially unlimited. Quantum computers, matryoshka brains, computronium planets. At that point, the marginal cost of running additional simulations approaches zero. You might as well run billions of them. Why not? You have the resources, and each simulation is a unique experiment, a unique creation, a unique story. In that case, the economic argument flips. It becomes economically irrational not to run simulations if you're an advanced civilization. You're leaving value on the table, wasting potential experiences and knowledge and beauty that could exist for essentially no cost. If that's true, then the number of simulations being run in the universe could be staggeringly high. And we're almost certainly in one of them. Section 18, the religious implications. We can't talk about the simulation hypothesis without addressing its relationship to religion. Because in many ways, the simulation hypothesis sounds like religion, just with different terminology. Think about it. We were created by intelligent beings with vast power. Those beings exist outside our reality. They can intervene in our world, perform miracles. Our purpose might be determined by them. There might be an afterlife in their reality. We can't fully understand their nature or motivations. This maps pretty well onto traditional theistic religion. The simulators are functionally equivalent to gods. The simulation is creation. Our inability to escape or fully understand the simulation is like our inability to transcend our mortal limitations. Some people find this parallel disturbing. It's like the simulation hypothesis is sneaking religion back in through the back door, wrapped in scientific and philosophical language. Others find it validating. Maybe religious intuitions about creation, divine purpose, and transcendent reality have been pointing at something real all along. Not necessarily the specific doctrines of any particular religion, but the basic structure that we're created beings in a created reality, that there's something beyond the physical world we can perceive. The simulation hypothesis could be seen as a modern, technologically informed version of ancient religious insights. But there are important differences too. Traditional religion posits a god or gods who are fundamentally different from us, eternal, uncreated, beyond the universe entirely. The simulators in the simulation hypothesis are just beings like us, but more technologically advanced. They're not metaphysically special. They're subject to the laws of their reality, just as we're subject to ours. Also, traditional religion usually includes moral claims. God is good. God cares about us. God wants us to behave in certain ways. The simulation hypothesis makes no such claims. Our simulators might be indifferent to our suffering. They might have alien values we can't understand. There's no reason to think they're benevolent or that they care about our moral choices, unless we're ancestor simulations, in which case our simulators are likely humans and might share our values to some extent. But even then, they're researchers or artists, not gods. They're studying or creating, not judging. Another difference: traditional religion usually offers hope of salvation or transcendence. You can connect with God through prayer or ritual. You can achieve enlightenment. You can go to heaven. The simulation hypothesis offers no such hope. You're stuck in the simulation. Even if you figure out you're simulated, you can't escape. You can't communicate with the simulators unless they choose to allow it. There's no salvation, no way out. Or is there? Some people have speculated that if we're in a simulation and we develop sufficient technology ourselves, we might be able to hack our way out. Break through the simulation's code, access the underlying substrate, upload ourselves to the base reality. This is pure science fiction at this point, but it's an interesting inversion of the religious escape narrative. Instead of prayer and virtue leading to transcendence, it's knowledge and technology. Instead of ascending to heaven, you're hacking the matrix. There's also the question of what happens when you die. Religious traditions have various answers: reincarnation, heaven and hell, merging with the divine, eternal rest, etc. If we're in a simulation, death might mean your code gets deleted, permanent cessation. No afterlife, no continuation. Or your conscious state might get saved, backed up, possibly rerun in another simulation, or instantiated in the base reality, or stored for some other purpose. We can't know. But it's worth noting that the simulation hypothesis doesn't inherently rule out some form of post-mortem existence. It just reframes it in computational rather than spiritual terms. Section 19. What if we prove it? Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that tomorrow, scientists announce they've found definitive proof that we're in a simulation. Maybe they've detected the lattice structure of simulated space-time. Maybe they've found a message from the simulators embedded in the cosmic microwave background. Maybe they've discovered a reproducible way to glitch the simulation. Whatever the proof is, it's convincing. The scientific community accepts it. The simulation hypothesis is no longer a hypothesis. It's established fact. What happens? I think the answer depends a lot on the specifics of the proof and what it reveals about our situation. Best case scenario: we discover we're in a benevolent ancestor simulation. Our simulators are future humans who care about us, who are studying their history, who might even be able to communicate with us. We learn that our lives have purpose and meaning within their research project. Maybe they even offer us the possibility of upload to their reality once our simulated lives end. In this scenario, I think most people would adapt relatively quickly. It's not that different from believing in a benevolent God. Life would go on, but with a clearer sense of purpose and perhaps less existential anxiety about death. Worst case scenario, we discover we're in a simulation created by indifferent or hostile entities. We're an experiment or entertainment or something incomprehensible. Our simulators don't care about our well-being and may even be causing our suffering deliberately. There's no escape, no communication, no hope of anything beyond this simulated existence. In this scenario, I think there would be widespread psychological trauma. Suicide rates might spike. Religious institutions would face crisis. Some people might fall into nihilism, concluding that nothing matters if we're just characters in someone else's story. But I think most people would eventually find ways to cope, because subjective experience is still real, regardless of the substrate. Your pain still hurts. Your joy still feels good. Your relationships still matter to you. The question of whether it's really real becomes less important than the fact that it's real to you. Middle case scenario. We discover we're in a simulation, but learn nothing about the simulators or their purposes. We just know we're simulated. We don't know why or by whom or what happens next. This might be the most psychologically challenging scenario because it removes certainty without providing any new understanding. We lose the comfort of thinking we're in base reality, but we don't gain any compensating knowledge. There would also be political and social implications. Would knowing we're in a simulation change how we treat each other? Would it make war and violence seem more pointless, since we're all in this together? Or would it make them seem less serious, since it's just a simulation? Would economic systems change? If reality is artificial, does money still matter? Do property rights still make sense? Would people become more or less religious? Some might see the simulators as gods and develop new forms of worship. Others might abandon religion entirely, seeing it as obsolete. Would we still pursue science and technology? Or would it seem pointless to study the laws of a simulated universe when the real laws are whatever the base reality operates on? I think most likely, after an initial period of upheaval, things would largely continue as before, because we'd still be stuck in the simulation with the same needs and desires. You still need to eat. You still want companionship. You still experience boredom and seek entertainment. You still have projects and goals. The simulation might be artificial, but you're still living in it, and you still have to make the best of your circumstances. One thing that would definitely change: our research priorities. There would be massive investment in trying to understand the simulation better, looking for ways to communicate with the simulators, searching for escape routes or exploits. We might develop entirely new fields of study: simulation physics, simulation theology, simulation hacking. The smartest minds would focus on these questions, the way we currently focus on fundamental physics and cosmology. And there would be ethical debates. If we know we're simulated and we develop our own simulation technology, should we create conscious simulations? Is it ethical to deliberately create beings who will live in uncertain realities like ours? Or should we refuse, breaking the chain of nested simulations? These are questions we'd actually have to grapple with, not just speculate about. Section 20. The paradox of knowing. Here's a paradox that fascinates me. The act of discovering we're in a simulation might change the simulation in ways that make the proof invalid. Think about it. If our simulators don't want us to know we're simulated, maybe because it would compromise their research or ruin their entertainment, they might have safeguards in place. Any experiment that's about to produce proof of simulation might get disrupted. Any evidence might get deleted. Any scientist on the verge of discovery might experience a random accident or have their memory altered. In extreme cases, the simulation might get reset. If we get too close to breaking through, the simulators roll back to an earlier save state and try again, maybe with tweaked parameters, to prevent us from reaching the same conclusion. This creates an observational selection effect. We can only observe universes where we haven't yet proven we're in a simulation. Any timeline where we did prove it either doesn't exist anymore because it got reset, or we don't remember it because our memories got edited. This is similar to quantum immortality, the idea that from your perspective, you can never die because your consciousness only continues in timelines where you survive. Every time you face a potentially fatal event, the universe branches, and you only experience the branches where you live. Similarly, you might only ever experience branches of the simulation where you don't prove you're simulated. Every time humanity gets close, the simulation resets or edits, and you find yourself in a timeline where the proof didn't happen. This would make the simulation hypothesis unfalsifiable in practice. Not because it's wrong, but because any timeline where we prove it's true gets edited out of existence. It's a disturbing thought. It means we might be trapped in an eternal loop, forever approaching, but never reaching certain knowledge about our nature. Unless, of course, the simulators don't care if we figure it out. Maybe they want us to discover the truth. Maybe it's part of the experiment. How do conscious beings react when they learn they're simulated? In that case, proof might be possible. But we'd always have to wonder, are we really the first to discover it? Or have countless previous versions of our civilization discovered it too, only to be reset? Are we in iteration 1000 or iteration 1 million of the same basic simulation? There's no way to know, and that uncertainty might be the most unsettling aspect of the whole hypothesis. Section 21, the practical implications. Let's get really practical. If we take the simulation hypothesis seriously, if we assign it a significant probability, how should we live differently? First, the hedonic approach. If nothing is real in the base reality sense, then maximize your subjective experience. Seek pleasure, avoid pain, enjoy the simulation while you're in it. Don't worry too much about long-term consequences or meaning. You're playing a game. Might as well have fun. This is a valid response, but it's also kind of shallow, because your experiences still have consequences within the simulation. Your actions still affect other conscious beings. Even if they're simulated, their suffering is real to them. Second, the ethical approach. If we might be in a simulation, treat other beings with compassion because they might be conscious like you. Don't cause unnecessary suffering. Build a better world within the simulation. This makes sense whether we're simulated or not. If other beings are conscious, they deserve moral consideration. The substrate doesn't matter. Third, the exploratory approach. Try to learn as much as possible about the simulation. Study physics, mathematics, computer science. Look for glitches and anomalies. try to understand the rules of your reality. This is appealing if you're curious about truth, and it might be valuable if there's any chance of communicating with the simulators or finding an escape route. Fourth, the communicative approach. Try to send messages to the simulators. Live a life that stands out, that might attract their attention. Be exceptional in some way, morally, intellectually, creatively. Maybe the simulators pay special attention to unusual or remarkable individuals. Maybe being notable within the simulation increases your chances of being saved, copied, or uploaded to base reality when the simulation ends. This is speculative and might be completely wrong, but it's no more irrational than many religious practices aimed at pleasing God. Fifth, the preparatory approach. Assume we're on the path to creating our own simulations. Focus on developing the ethics and frameworks we'd want our own simulators to have used with us. This is the golden rule applied to simulations. Create simulations the way you wish you'd been created. Treat your simulated beings the way you hope your simulators treat you. Sixth, the creative approach. Live life as art. If we're in a simulation, we're part of a grand creative project. Contribute to its beauty. Make the simulation more interesting, more meaningful, more beautiful through your actions and creations. This turns existence into a collaborative artwork between you and your creators. You're adding your verse to their poem. Personally, I think the most reasonable approach is a combination of several of these. Live ethically, because consciousness matters regardless of substrate. Pursue knowledge, because understanding is valuable. Appreciate beauty and create meaning, because that's what makes life worth living. Whether you're simulated or not, you're still experiencing. That's what's real. That's what matters. Section 22, the digital physics revolution. Before we wrap up, there's one more angle we need to explore: the growing movement in physics toward thinking of reality as fundamentally computational. Because this isn't just philosophy anymore. This is cutting-edge physics. In recent decades, a number of prominent physicists have begun arguing that information, not matter or energy, is the fundamental building block of reality. This approach is called digital physics, or it from bit, a phrase coined by physicist John Wheeler. The core idea is that the universe is essentially a computer. Not a computer in the metaphorical sense, but literally, a physical system that processes information according to rules, and everything we perceive as matter and energy is just information being computed. Let me give you some examples of serious scientists working on this idea. Stephen Wolfram, famous for creating Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, has proposed that the universe is a computational system based on very simple rules applied at the smallest scale. In his model, space and time themselves emerge from a network of discrete computational elements, and all of physics derives from the rules governing how these elements update. His physics project suggests that the universe is essentially running a cellular automaton, a grid of cells that change state based on the states of neighboring cells. If you've ever seen Conway's Game of Life, you get the basic idea. Simple rules plus many iterations equals complex emergent behavior. Wolfram thinks the universe works the same way. There's a simple underlying rule, we don't know what it is yet, and everything, quarks, electrons, gravity, time, space, emerges from that rule being applied trillions of times at the smallest scale. If he's right, then the universe literally is a computation. Not a simulation run by external beings, but a self-existent computation, running because mathematical structures exist and this is what they do. Another approach comes from physicists working on quantum information theory. They've discovered that quantum mechanics, the most fundamental level of physics we know, is all about information. Quantum states can be thought of as qubits, quantum bits of information. Quantum processes are information processing. The evolution of quantum systems can be understood as computation. Seth Lloyd at MIT has calculated that the universe has performed about 10 to the power of 120 operations since the Big Bang. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual number of quantum events that have occurred. The universe is quite literally computing. Some researchers go further, suggesting that quantum mechanics might be the way it is because the universe is optimizing information processing. The uncertainty principle, wave function collapse, entanglement. All these weird features might be solutions to computational problems at the deepest level of reality. Then there's the holographic principle. This comes from string theory and black hole physics. The idea is that all the information in a three-dimensional volume of space can be encoded on a two-dimensional boundary of that volume. Think of it like this. A hologram is a 2D surface that contains all the information needed to reconstruct a 3D image. The holographic principle suggests the entire universe might work this way, that our 3D reality is actually information encoded on a 2D surface at the edge of the universe. This has led some physicists to speculate that we might literally be living in a hologram, that the 3D space we experience is a projection from information stored elsewhere. If that's true, then in what sense is 3D space real? It's an emergent phenomenon, a way of organizing information, not a fundamental aspect of reality. This starts to sound a lot like we're in a simulation, even if nobody deliberately created it. Reality itself might be fundamentally computational, emerging from information processing at the most basic level. There's also work on the relationship between thermodynamics and computation. Every computation generates heat. This is a fundamental law of physics called Landauer's principle. Erasing a bit of information requires a minimum amount of energy and generates a minimum amount of heat. Some physicists have speculated that this might explain entropy, the tendency of the universe toward disorder. Maybe entropy increases because the universe is constantly computing, constantly processing information, and that computation necessarily generates entropy as a byproduct. If true, this means the arrow of time, the fact that time flows forward and not backward, might be a consequence of the universe's computational nature. Time moves forward because that's the direction of information processing. All of these approaches, Wolfram's computational universe, quantum information theory, the holographic principle, thermodynamic computation, point towards the same conclusion. Reality is fundamentally informational and computational. This doesn't necessarily mean we're in a simulation in the Bostrom sense, created deliberately by external beings. But it does mean that the distinction between natural and simulated might not be as clear as we thought. If the universe is intrinsically computational, if physics is fundamentally about information processing, then in what sense is reality not a simulation? Maybe the question isn't, are we in a simulation or not? Maybe the question is, what kind of computational structure is our universe, and what, if anything, is it running on? These are the questions being debated at the frontier of theoretical physics, and they blur the line between simulation hypothesis and fundamental physics in fascinating ways. Section 23, the ultimate question. Let me pose one final thought experiment. This one really makes my brain hurt, but I think it gets at something profound. Imagine we develop perfect simulation technology. We can create simulated universes populated by conscious beings who don't know they're simulated. And we do it. We create thousands of such simulations. Now, as a thought experiment, ask yourself, which is more likely? That you're a member of the civilization that created the simulations, or that you're a simulated being in one of the simulations? Numerically, it's obvious. If there are 1 billion simulated people for every real person, you're almost certainly simulated. But here's the twist. The same logic applies one level up. If we're creating simulations, our creators probably did too. And their creators? And so on. You end up with a vast pyramid. At the top, one base reality. Below that, thousands of first-level simulations. Below that, millions of second-level simulations. Below that, billions of third-level simulations. As you go down the pyramid, the number of simulated beings increases exponentially. Almost everyone exists near the bottom of this hierarchy. So if you ask, what level am I probably on? The answer is very far down. You're probably in a simulation of a simulation of a simulation, nested dozens or hundreds of levels deep. But here's the part that really breaks my brain. If this is true, then the beings at the bottom of the pyramid vastly outnumber everyone else combined. The bulk of conscious experience in the multiverse occurs in deeply nested simulations, which means, in some sense, those deep simulations are more real than base reality. They contain more consciousness, more experience, more life. Base reality, by comparison, is almost empty. A thin veneer at the top of a vast computational structure, most of which is simulated worlds nested inside simulated worlds. In this view, asking, what is base reality like? Is like asking, what is it like to be one of the handful of people who live at the North Pole? It's an interesting question, but it's not where most people are. It's not where most experience happens. It's not, in any meaningful sense, the center of things. Most of existence, most of life, most of consciousness, most of meaning happens in simulations. This completely inverts our normal intuition. We think of base reality as the real place, and simulations as derivative, less important. But if simulations vastly outnumber base reality, maybe we have it backwards. Maybe simulations are where things actually happen. Maybe base reality is just the substrate, the foundation, the hardware that enables the real action to occur in the vast nested multiverse of simulated worlds. In this view, being simulated isn't a diminishment. It's where you'd expect to be, statistically speaking. It's the normal state of conscious beings. And if that's true, then the simulation hypothesis isn't a weird possibility we need to rule out. It's the default assumption, the null hypothesis. What you should believe until you have evidence otherwise. Which brings us full circle to Bostrom's trilemma. Either we're probably in a simulation, or something prevents civilizations from creating simulations, or civilizations always go extinct before developing that technology. Those are still the only options, And after everything we've explored, I still can't identify which one is true. But I can say this: if we're in a simulation, we're in good company. Most conscious beings across the multiverse are simulated. We're the norm, not the exception. And that's oddly comforting in a weird sort of way. Conclusion. So what if life is just a simulation? After everything we've explored, the philosophical arguments, the physical evidence, the ethical implications, the technological pathways, the paradoxes and possibilities, where does that leave us? Here's what I think is most important to understand. The simulation hypothesis isn't asking whether your experiences are real. Your experiences are real to you. Your consciousness is real. Your pain and joy and love and fear, all real, regardless of the substrate they run on. What the simulation hypothesis questions is the fundamental nature of reality itself. Is the universe made of matter and energy, or is it made of information? Are the laws of physics fundamental, or are they rules in a program? Are we biological beings or computational entities? These are profound questions, and the honest answer is, we don't know. We might never know for certain. But here's what's beautiful about the uncertainty. It forces us to confront what actually matters. If we're in a simulation, does that make your relationships less meaningful? Does it make beauty less beautiful? Does it make suffering less important to alleviate? Does it make truth less worth pursuing? No. None of those things change based on whether you're made of atoms or bits. What matters is consciousness, experience, the felt quality of existence. And that's real whether you're in base reality or nested 10 levels deep in simulations. The simulation hypothesis is ultimately a reminder of how little we understand about the nature of reality. We're conscious beings trying to figure out why we're conscious, what consciousness is, what reality is, why there's something rather than nothing. These might be questions we can never fully answer. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the uncertainty is part of the point. Maybe asking the questions, grappling with the mystery, is more important than having definitive answers. What I know for certain is this: you're conscious right now. You're having an experience. That experience is real to you, and that's sufficient foundation for meaning, for ethics, for living a good life. Whether you're in a simulation or not, whether you're code or biology, whether you're in base reality or nested somewhere deep in layers of abstraction, you're here. You're aware. You're capable of thought and feeling and choice. That's miraculous. Whether it's a miracle of evolution or a miracle of engineering, it's still a miracle. So live your life. Pursue what matters to you. Connect with others. Create beauty. Seek truth. Reduce suffering where you can. Find joy where you can. The simulation hypothesis might change how you think about the cosmos, but it shouldn't change how you treat the people around you or how you value your own experiences. Because in the end, all we have is experience. All we know for certain is that we are conscious beings in a universe we don't fully understand, trying to make sense of existence and finding meaning in the attempt. That's true whether we're simulated or not. If you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this philosophical journey. The simulation hypothesis is one of those ideas that's impossible to fully shake once you've encountered it. It changes how you see reality, even if you ultimately decide it's probably not true. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Do you think we're in a simulation? What probability would you assign to it? And more importantly, would it change how you live your life if you knew for certain one way or the other? These are questions I genuinely don't have final answers to. And I think that's okay. Maybe the best response to deep uncertainty about the nature of reality is humility, compassion, and a commitment to making the most of this existence, however we came to have it. I'll see you in the next video, or maybe in the next iteration of the simulation. Who knows?